Luke chapter 15, so I apologize for that. Apparently I'm having you rely on your bulletin. So this parable this morning is probably very familiar to many of you. And I would guess that at some point in time in your life when you've heard this, you've tried to place yourself maybe even as a character in the story. Maybe you felt like the prodigal, or maybe you felt like the older son. Perhaps even the father who had to watch the child go away and make some poor choices. Those are difficult situations. But really, that's not what I want to focus on this morning. I'm not so concerned as to who it is that's in this story as the elements that are in it. In other words, what is it that God is trying to teach us? And what is it in there that He's calling us to do to enhance our relationship with Him? Because that's what I think is really important to glean from this parable. Remember that the audience was made up of sinners and tax collectors, the scribes and the Pharisees. I believe it would be safe to say that that includes us too. Romans remind us that all fall short of the glory of God. We're all sinners. So whether we've been a prodigal or an older son or the father, it doesn't matter. There's something in this message for each one of us. The parable starts out talking about a father who had 2 children. And they've lived with the father their whole life. They've been a part of the farm, if you will. The family business. We know that because there were hired hands. And I think as well it would be true to say that this is all these guys have ever known. These children have had the father provide for them. Shelter, food, clothing, work. These guys have had to live under the father's rules. And at some point in time, the younger son, known as the prodigal, rebels. No longer wanting to live under the father's rules. Perhaps he's seen life outside of the farm. Perhaps he's seen what it might look like outside of living with the father. And it's awful enticing. Have any of us ever done such a thing? Maybe you grew up in a house and your parents were good providers, but you didn't like the rules. And so off you went. Or maybe, how many people here have grown up in the church? That's pretty much all they've ever known. And there comes a time in your life where, you know what? It looks pretty good sometimes outside the church. It looks like more fun. They don't have to get up on Sunday morning. They can party all Saturday night. They don't have to go to Wednesday night groups. And there's this rebellion that happens. And this prodigal went to the father and said, hey, I want my share of the inheritance. Do you understand what it means for that young man to have said that to his father? If I'm a parent with 2 children and I'm going to give everything I have to my children, that means I'm going to have to take half of everything I have to give it to just this one son. So by him demanding his portion of his inheritance, it's as though he's wishing me dead. And that means I have to sell half of everything to give it to him, which would be no easy feat. I think of myself with 4 kids, just to take a quarter of what I have and sell it. It's not like you can say, well, I have 50 cattle, here, you take 25. The guy wasn't interested in the cattle. He wanted his portion of the inheritance in the form of finances so he could go away. And we see that he went off to a distant country. I think it would be fair to say that a distant country is that area where God is not allowed. For this young man to have left his home and everything he knows means that he also walked away from his faith. And for me, that would be a bigger blow than to simply have them walk away from my home. I pray for my children's salvation and their spiritual growth most every day. And it is my prayer that they would never walk away from their faith. But by this prodigal leaving and going off to a distant country, he's going off to a place where God is not a part of that. And I question how many of us have places in our lives where God is not allowed. We might play the game that life is good and life is pretty, but we have these places. Maybe it's work, maybe it's marriage, maybe it's our secret sin or our addiction. But we have these areas of our life where they're closed off to God. God is not allowed. Because the things that this young man did while he was in that distant country were not the things of God. They didn't glorify God. It says he got caught up in dissolute living. And what happens? A severe famine hits, and he runs out of money. And all of a sudden he realizes, I'm starving to death. I can't help but think, well, where's all the friends you partied with? I'm sure at some point he was the life of the party. He had the money. He probably provided the place, the booze, the drugs, the women, the place to stay. Anybody got a friend like that? As long as you're providing, they're around. But when you're not, are they really friends? He starts to think back to what life was like at home. Wow, even my dad's hired hands have it better than me. See, sometimes we're a victim of circumstances, and sometimes it's our own doing that puts us in the position that we're in. There was a famine in the land. You can't control that, can we? Sometimes there's an earthquake, a tornado, a flood, a fire. There's things that are beyond our control that become a victim of circumstance. But there's other situations we find ourselves in that, frankly, we're responsible for. It's the choices we've made that put us in the position we're in. This young man may have been a victim of both, but I think it's safer to say, because even if there had been a famine, if he had saved, if he had planned, he probably wouldn't have been in such a dire need. So he hires himself out, and he finds himself feeding pigs. He's Jewish, for goodness sake. He's not supposed to be with pork, right? And there he is, thinking that the food he feeds the pigs looks awful darn good. He's in what I call a pig pen situation. He's at the lowest of the low. He's at a point of complete desperation. And what does our text tell us that he does? It says he came to himself. He came to himself. He came to his senses, is what some translations say. He came to a point in his life where he was at the lowest of the low. And in the silence of that pig pen, there were no distractions. There was no one to tell him. There was just this opportunity to look inside himself. This is that point of an awakening, because he had a choice to make. He had a choice to make what he was going to do next. And he took some time, and he looked inside himself, and he got really honest with what he saw. He took inventory of his life. Where am I going? What am I doing? What is the path that I'm on going to lead to? Is this where I want to go? Is this really where I want to be? What's this going to look like in a year, or 5 years, or 10 years? See, you can have an awakening in your life, but if you don't use that to truly look inside yourself and be honest with yourself, it's really an epiphany. It's this awareness of a situation. But in his honesty, he said, you know what? I made a bad choice. And now I got to do something about it. I need to go home. If only my dad would hire me. I need to go home and I need to say to my father, I have sinned against you and against God. Please, please forgive me. and he does something about it. So often we get caught up in life, and life scoops us up, and it passes on, and all of a sudden we look at our life and we go, how did I get here? Anybody ever do that before? You go, ooh, how did I get here? You know, maybe it went from touching to a positive pregnancy test. Maybe it went from an occasional drink to dependency. Maybe it went from flirting to an affair. Maybe it went from recreational use of drugs and thinking you can control it to an addiction. I don't know, lottery tickets to gambling the life savings. But at some point in time, if we don't stop and inventory where we're at in our life, we end up in places we've never planned on being at. And wouldn't it be good to do that before we get to this pig pen situation, if you will? And when we inventory our life, we do something about it. The awareness without the action doesn't get us very far. It's just a point of self-realization. This young man, he gets up, he goes home. And yet, while he was still a far ways off, his father saw him and ran to him. The audience of that day, having heard those words, would have been aghast. And the reason is, the patriarch of the family ran to no one. People ran to them. So the thought that this father ran to his son while he was still far ways off means that the father was watching and waiting for that son to come home. There is no other God in religion that pursues you. They all wait for you to pursue them. We have a Heavenly Father who is watching and waiting for each one of us and pursuing us relentlessly. And he came to him. And while that man was crying and sobbing in his father's arms, I am so sorry, forgive me, I've sinned against you and against God. His father kisses him. It says he's filled with compassion. I'm sure he didn't say, I told you so, as much as he may have wanted to. He said, I love you. Welcome home. I love you. You're my child. I love you. And he called for his slaves to bring out the robe and the ring, the finest, the signets of the family. That ring said, you are part of my family. And that's how God operates. When we come to the Father allows us into the family. We have full rights. He doesn't say, well, I'm only going to give you this much. No, everything I have is yours. You are part of the family. The young man only wanted to be a hired hand. Killed the fatted calf, let's have a party. My son was dead, he's now alive. Just as there's a party in heaven when only one sinner repents. Now the older son, he's out in the field. And he hears this ruckus. And as he starts coming towards the house, one of the other people comes out and say, hey, there's a big party going on. Really, what's happening? Well, your brother, he's back. Your dad's having a party, he's even killing the fatted calf. He's angry. He's really angry. See, meat is not a staple in the meal of that time. So to know that they killed the fatted calf means something big's going on. That's a really special occasion. What do you mean? And the father, who once again went against the cultural norm, went to his son. He goes now to the older son. And he says, son, come join the party. Your brother's home. He's home. What does the older boy say? What do you mean? All these years, I'll go to Dan because he's good at that. All these years I've been working like a slave for you. You remember he's the dirty, wicked slave, right? Whom I love so much. Right? He's like, listen, I've been working like a slave all these years. How is it that your son who ran away and took everything, and you're going to give him a party? Come on. This isn't fair. And this is where I want to hit the pause button. Time out. If you love the Father, are you working like a slave for him? Do you work like a slave for the Father? Seriously, we need to take inventory of ourselves. Some of us are the older brother. We've always been to church. We've always done what's right. We help, we serve, we do this, we do that. But why are we doing it? Are we doing it out of obligation? Are we doing it out of love for the Father? What's our motive? While God may honor the obligation, He really wants your heart more than anything. Because if you're serving to make yourself feel good, frankly, you're just serving. Bad people do good things too. You got to do it for the right reasons. When Jesus was talking about the older brother, He was talking to the Pharisees and the scribes, those religious people who did everything right. And He knew that their heart was not into what they were doing, just as the older son was not. If only the older son could have had that awakening. If only the older son could have been honest with himself. Wow, I do what I do not out of love, but out of obligation, or for whatever motive there is. Perhaps he, too, could enjoy that love of the Father. Because I don't believe he was feeling God's love at that point. I don't believe he was feeling the love of the Father. Or he wouldn't be talking like that. So what I really think is important in this parable are three elements. Having an awakening, being honest with ourselves, and doing something about it. How many times have you been in conversation with someone who keeps bringing up the same thing over and over, and all they do is complain about it? And you so desperately want to look at them and say, then do something about it, right? That's what I'm talking about. We talk about our situations, and sometimes we even wallow in our self-pity. That man, that prodigal, could have sat in that pig pen and just wallowed in his self-pity. But instead, he made a choice to do something about it. He got honest with himself, and he did something. And that's what I believe God's calling us to do. He wants to be in relationship with us. He's watching and waiting for each and every one of us. He's full of compassion and eager to wrap his arms around us and fill us with his love. He's ready for a party. The robe and the ring are ready for you. But what are you going to do about it? In just a few weeks, we're going to start our next small group study. And the name of it is AHA, A-H-A, Awakening, Honesty, Action. And we're going to spend some time doing some inventorying of our life. Perhaps looking at where we're at and where we're going. And what are we going to do to change the path we're on? And so I ask that you would prayerfully consider being a part of a small group. We have one going on a Sunday and a Wednesday, but that doesn't mean that someone can't start one in their own home on a Monday or a Tuesday or any other day. But it is my prayer that we would get connected with one another and with God. Certainly when we work together, we're able to glean so much more wisdom. Again, I pray that you will take an inventory of your life and that you will come to your senses and run to the Father who loves you so very, very much. Let us pray.